The sun had barely begun to lift the frost from the grass when Henry Cole trudged back toward his wagon, boots crunching on the frozen ground. The early morning air cut through his coat like a blade, stinging his lungs with every breath. His horse was tethered down near the creek, and after making sure she was watered and fed, Henry had expected nothing more than a quiet, uneventful morning before resuming his journey west. But as he rounded the side of the wagon, something felt off. The canvas tarp that covered his goods sagged oddly, not the way it usually did when secured for the night. He stopped, his instincts sharpening. The silence was thick, no birdsong, no rustle of wind through the sparse pines. He placed a gloved hand on the wagon sideboard and hesitated. In years of trading up and down the frontier, Henry had learned that surprises rarely brought good news. Slowly, he pulled back the tarp. His breath caught. There, huddled in the dim light, were 4 children, thin, dirty, and trembling as though they'd been carved from ice. Their clothes were worn to rags, their cheeks hollow, eyes wide and shining with fear. The smallest, no older than 4, clung to the arm of an older boy who couldn't have been more than 12. Beside them, half covered by a torn shawl, lay a woman. She was pale, her lips cracked, her skin clammy with fever. A dark, half-dried smear of blood traced down from a gash at her temple, disappearing into her matted hair. She didn't stir. Henry's fingers tightened on the tarp. For a long moment, nobody moved. The children stared back at him like cornered animals, ready to bolt if they had the strength. His first instinct was to ask who they were and why they were here, but before he could open his mouth, the smallest child's voice cracked through the stillness. "Don't kill us." It was barely more than a whisper, but it hit Henry harder than any shout. He froze, the words sinking in. The boy's voice shook, each syllable quivering with terror. "I'm not here to hurt you," Henry said quietly, crouching down so he wouldn't loom over them. "You're safe now." But the eldest child, the boy with sharp eyes and a wary posture, shifted to place himself between Henry and the others. His jaw was set, his small frame tense. He didn't believe a word of it, not yet. Henry reached into the wagon slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. He pulled his canteen from his belt and offered it. "Water," he said softly, looking to the eldest boy. The boy hesitated, then took it. He tipped it toward the little one first, who drank greedily, coughing a little before passing it to the others. The woman stirred at the sound, her head rolling weakly to the side. Henry could see her pulse beating fast in her neck, too fast. She tried to lift herself, but a sharp breath escaped her lips and she collapsed again. "You're hurt," Henry murmured, more to himself than to her. No one spoke. The children kept their eyes fixed on him, watching every move. Henry glanced over his shoulder at the empty plain beyond his camp. Whoever these people were, they hadn't just wandered here by chance. The raw fear in the smallest child's plea, the guarded stance of the eldest, the injury to the woman, it all told him there was a story here, and not a good one. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He could send them away and keep himself out of trouble, or he could take them in and inherit whatever danger had driven them to his wagon in the first place. Henry's choice came quicker than he expected. "All right," he said softly, looking at the boy. "Let's get her warm. I've got a fire going." For the first time, the boy's eyes flickered, not with trust, but with something less certain. And as Henry helped ease the woman out from the wagon, the smallest child still clutched the boy's sleeve, whispering again, so faint Henry almost missed it, "Don't kill us." Henry eased the woman down onto a folded blanket near the fire, careful not to jar her head. The wound was crusted with dried blood, but the swelling along her temple worried him more. She mumbled something, words lost in the haze of pain before Slipping back into unconsciousness, the four children huddled together a few paces away, their small shoulders hunched, eyes darting between Henry's face and the woman. The eldest boy kept a protective arm around the youngest, his jaw tight as if daring Henry to make the wrong move. Henry crouched beside the fire, stirring the embers back to life. "There's tea," he said, more to fill the silence than anything else. He poured water into a tin cup and set it over the flames. "Warms you up quick." No answer. He glanced up. The little one, the same who had whispered those haunting words, was peeking at him from behind the eldest boy's arm. The child's lips trembled as though wanting to speak, but too afraid. Henry tried again, his voice low and steady. "You. Folks have a name?" Still nothing. The eldest boy's eyes were sharp, assessing, like a man deciding whether to trust a stranger with his last coin. Henry leaned back on his heels and sighed. "All right, no names then. Just warmth and food." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small loaf of bread, breaking it into rough chunks. He set them on a cloth between himself and the children, close enough to reach but far enough they wouldn't think it was a trick. The oldest didn't move at first. Then, after a long moment, he nudged one of the younger girls forward. She snatched a piece, retreating instantly, her eyes never leaving Henry's hands. Soon, the others followed, their hunger overriding caution, except the eldest, who still hadn't touched the food. Henry respected it. Distrust had probably kept this boy alive. The tea was ready. Henry poured it into the tin cup and set it near the bread. "For her," he said, nodding toward the injured woman. This time the eldest boy stepped forward, slow and measured. He took the cup, cradling it carefully, and knelt beside the woman. "Ma," he murmured, trying to rouse her. She blinked, eyes glassy, and sipped weakly when he pressed the cup to her lips. Henry caught the way the boy's hand trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of responsibility far too big for him. When she'd taken a few sips, the boy set the cup down and looked at Henry. His voice was rough from disuse. "We didn't mean to take your wagon." Henry shook his head. "Doesn't matter. You needed shelter." The boy hesitated, then asked the question Henry had been waiting for. "You gonna make us leave?" Henry's gaze moved over the four thin faces, the woman barely conscious beside them. "No," he said simply. "Not until you're safe." The boy studied him for a long beat, then gave the faintest nod. But Henry noticed how his shoulders stayed tense, like a door left half closed. Trust would take time, if it ever came. The wind shifted, carrying a sound from somewhere far off, a faint, rhythmic thud. Hooves. Henry's head turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. In that instant, he knew these people weren't just runaways or drifters. Someone was looking for them. And if the riders reached his camp, this fragile bubble of safety would shatter before it had even formed. Henry banked the fire low and spoke in a steady, measured tone. "Eat quick," he told them. "We might need to move before the sun's high." The eldest boy's eyes sharpened again. He understood Dot, and for the first time, Henry saw more than fear in the child's face. He saw the glimmer of a shared resolve. Henry worked in silence, his hands steady as he tore strips from a clean cloth and soaked them in the warm water by the fire. The woman's breathing was shallow, her face pale beneath a thin layer of grime. He gently pressed the damp cloth to her wound, wiping away the dried blood. She winced but didn't pull away. The children had gathered a little closer now, their earlier fear softening into something elsewhere, curiosity. The smallest girl, no more than 6, sat cross-legged with a piece of bread in her lap, nibbling in tiny bites as though afraid it might vanish if she ate too fast. "You've been out in the cold for a while," Henry said, his voice quiet. More an observation than a question. For a long moment, no one answered. Then the eldest boy, dark-haired, eyes older than his years, shifted his weight and spoke. We left 2 nights ago." Henry glanced at him but didn't interrupt. The boy's tone was flat, as if each word had been weighed before leaving. His mouth. "Men came to our place after dark," the boy continued. "They had guns. Pa told us to get in the cellar, but before we could—" His voice caught for a second, a barely audible hitch before he pushed on. "They shot him." The little one beside him whimpered, clutching the boy's sleeve. He put an arm around her automatically, keeping his gaze fixed on the ground. "Our ma pulled us out the back door," he said. "We ran into the woods." Kept moving till it got too dark to see. Henry tied the cloth around the woman's head, securing it gently. "And you've been hiding since?" The boy nodded. "We didn't have food. Just water from the creek." The older girl, maybe 9, spoke up for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "We thought we were gonna freeze." The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering. "Open." She looked around in confusion, then focused on Henry. Her lips parted, but only a raspy sound came out. "Easy," Henry said. "You're safe for now." But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe it. Her gaze darted toward the edge of the camp, scanning the tree line like someone expecting shadows to emerge at any moment. The eldest boy added, "Last night we found your wagon. Thought maybe it was empty. We just needed someplace to get." "Warm." Henry sat back on his heels, studying them. They'd been running for 2 days, in the dead of winter, after seeing their father killed. No food, no shelter, no sense of how far behind their pursuers might be. Those men. Henry said carefully, "Do you know who they were?" The boy hesitated, glancing at his mother before answering. "One of them worked for Mr. McCrae." Henry's jaw tightened. He'd heard the name before, a rancher with too much land, too much money, and too many hired guns to keep both. The kind of man who didn't let go of what he thought was his dot. The fire popped, sending sparks into the cold air. Henry leaned closer to the boy. "You think they'll follow you?" The boy's eyes finally met his, steady and unflinching. "I know they will." Henry glanced toward the open prairie beyond camp. The hoofbeats he'd heard earlier came back to mind. Whoever McCrae had sent wouldn't be far, not with fresh tracks in the snow to follow. He began rolling up his blankets, tightening the straps on his packs. "Then we can't stay here," he said. "You all ride with me." The children exchanged uncertain glances. Their mother tried to protest, her voice little more than a croak. We can't." "You can," Henry said firmly, meeting her eyes. "And you will. If we stay here, they'll find us before nightfall." For a moment, no one moved. Then the eldest boy gave a slow nod. It wasn't trust nod yet, but it was agreement. Henry banked the fire, swung up into the wagon seat, and reached down a hand. "Let's move before they catch our trail." As the children climbed in, the wagon creaked under their weight. Somewhere far to the west, the faint sound of a horse's whinny carried on the wind. They were already being hunted. Asterisk. The wagon wheels groaned over the frozen ruts as Henry steered toward a narrow track through the cottonwoods. He chose it deliberately less. Open ground for anyone to spot them from a distance, more cover to break a pursuer's line of sight. The horse's breath steamed in the cold air, each exhale like a warning signal against the stillness of the morning. The children sat in the back, bundled in blankets. The smallest girl had fallen asleep against her older sister's shoulder, but the eldest boy was upright, watching everything as if expecting danger at any moment. His eyes kept flicking toward the road behind them, mirroring Henry's own unease. After an hour, the trees thinned. Henry slowed the wagon and leaned down, scanning the frozen dirt where the track met open ground. Fresh prints, horse hooves, at least 3 sets pressed deep into the frost. The edges were still sharp, not softened by wind or sun. Henry's stomach sank. These riders weren't far ahead, and by the angle of the tracks, they weren't simply Passing through, they'd cut across the land in a way that suggested they were searching. He hopped down from the seat, crouching low to study the prints. Big gelding, two smaller mares, he muttered to himself. Ridden hard. The eldest boy had crept to the back of the wagon to watch. Is it them? He asked. Henry met his gaze. I'd bet my last dollar. The boy's jaw tightened, confirming what Henry already suspected. These weren't strangers on the trail. The men were looking for them specifically. Henry climbed back onto the seat and turned the wagon sharply away from the direction the tracks were heading. We'll take the creek bed for a stretch, he said. It'll hide our trail. The boy didn't answer, but Henry caught the faintest shift in his posture approval, maybe even a flicker of hope. By midday, the sun was bright but offered no warmth. They followed the frozen creek, the wagon wheels crunching over patches of ice. Henry kept scanning the ridges on either side, wary of movement. Twice he thought he saw something, a flash of sunlight on metal, a shadow where it shouldn't be, but each time it vanished before he could be sure. The mother stirred, opening her eyes. Her voice was weak, but urgent. You can't outrun them forever. Henry didn't slow. Maybe not. But I can make it a lot harder for them to catch us. She tried to sit up, wincing. If they find us, they'll kill you too. Henry kept his eyes forward. I've had worse threats. They pressed on until the creek bent sharply east. That's when Henry spotted it on the far ridge, silhouetted. Against the winter sky, a lone rider sat watching them. The distance was too great to make out his face, but the way he sat in the saddle, still as stone, made Henry's skin crawl. The eldest boy saw him too. That's McRae's man, he said quietly, voice edged with certainty. Henry didn't reply. He snapped the reins, urging the horse into a faster trot. The rider didn't follow immediately. Instead, he turned his horse and disappeared over the ridge. That was worse. Henry knew what that meant. The man wasn't chasing, he was signaling, moving to cut them off. Henry's grip on the reins tightened. Change of plans, he called back. We don't stop until dark. The children clung tighter to one another as the wagon rattled over the frozen ground. Somewhere out there, unseen, the shadows were closing in. The sun crawled toward the horizon, its pale winter light fading into a bruised purple sky. Henry kept the wagon moving, pushing the horse harder than he liked, but there was no choice. Every sound behind them, every snapping branch, every distant echo felt like the start of an ambush. The creek bed had given them some cover, but it couldn't hide them forever. The snow along its banks was too shallow now, and soon wagon ruts would be plain to see. Henry turned the wagon up a rocky incline, wheels grinding over stones, until they reached a narrow deer trail that wound through thick pines. The eldest boy climbed onto the seat beside him, clutching the edge for balance. You think they're close? Henry kept his eyes on the twisting trail ahead. Close enough that we can't stop. The boy nodded once, no more questions. He was smart enough to know that sometimes silence was the best way to survive. By full dark, the temperature had dropped sharply. The smallest girl whimpered in the back, her teeth chattering. Henry knew they couldn't keep going without risking frostbite or worse. But stopping too long meant giving their pursuers a chance to close in. He found a sheltered hollow between two ridges, barely large enough to hide the wagon. They rolled in, and he pulled the horse to a stop. No fire, he told them. Light will draw them in. The children huddled together under blankets while Henry rummaged through his supplies. He broke out dried meat, hard biscuits, and a small tin of honey. The eldest boy distributed the food carefully, making sure everyone got something before taking his own share. Henry knelt beside the injured woman. Her fever had worsened, beads of sweat gathering along her brow despite the bitter cold. He mixed crushed willow bark into a small tin of water and coaxed her to drink. This might help, he murmured. Her eyes opened briefly, clouded with pain. Don't let them take the children, she whispered. They won't, Henry said, with more conviction than he felt. A sound cut through the night, soft, rhythmic, coming from beyond the ridge. Hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, like men riding. Without hurry, because they knew their prey was close. Henry moved fast. Blankets around your shoulders, he told the children. Quiet now. They obeyed without question. Henry led the horse deeper into the hollow, tying her behind a cluster of low pines. He covered the wagon wheels with branches, masking the shape in case the riders passed nearby. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the stone walls of the ridges. Henry crouched in the shadows, one hand resting on the rifle across his knees. The eldest boy crouched beside him, tense but silent. Two riders appeared on the trail above, dark silhouettes against the starlit sky. They stopped, scanning the hollow. Below, Henry could see the gleam of metal in their hands. One of them leaned toward the other and said something Henry couldn't make out. Then, slowly, their horses began to descend the ridge. Henry's breath was steady, but his heart pounded in his ears. They weren't just passing, they were searching. The smallest girl made a tiny sound, muffled against her sister's shoulder. Henry shot the eldest boy a sharp look, and the boy nodded, tightening his hold around the others. The riders came within 20 paces. One of them stood in the stirrups, peering into the shadows where the wagon was hidden. Henry's thumb rested on the hammer of his rifle. If they spotted the children, there would be no time for words-only action. Then, somewhere far off to the east, a wolf howled. The sound echoed through the valley, and the riders turned their heads toward it. After a moment, one of them spat into the snow, muttered something, and jerked his reins. The horses turned, climbing back toward the trail above. Henry didn't move until the hoofbeats had faded completely. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. We can't hide again, he said quietly. Next time, they'll find us. The boy looked at him. So what do we do? Henry tightened his grip on the rifle. We run, and we make it to town before sunrise. The cold was a living thing, biting at every exposed inch of skin as Henry coaxed the horse back onto the narrow trail. The moon had risen high and bright, casting silver light over the frozen land. Beautiful, but treacherous for anyone trying to move unseen. They traveled in silence. The wagon creaked, the horses' hooves crunched through patches of snow, and Henry's ears strained for any sound that didn't belong. The children huddled under the blankets, their heads nodding from exhaustion. The injured woman shifted weakly, murmuring in fevered dreams. It was near dawn when the first sign came, a distant echo. Hoofbeats. This time there was no mistaking it. They were coming fast. Henry snapped the reins. Hold tight, he called back. The wagon jolted forward, bouncing over frozen ruts. The eldest boy gripped the sideboards, keeping the younger ones from sliding. Henry took the back trails, winding between thickets of bare willows and stretches of open ground. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw them, 3 riders cresting a low hill, their silhouettes sharp against the pale morning sky. They'd found the trail. The horse snorted, steam curling from its nostrils as Henry urged it faster. The frozen ground rang beneath the hooves, the wagon rattling dangerously with every jolt. Can we make it? The boy shouted over the noise. Henry didn't answer. He wasn't sure himself. Ahead, a shallow creek cut across the trail. The ice was thin and the water below black with cold. Henry's mind raced. If he slowed to cross safely, they'd be overtaken. If he pushed too hard, the ice might crack beneath the wagon's weight. The riders were closing. He could hear them, shouting now, their voices sharp and angry. Henry gritted his teeth. Hold on. The horse hit the creek at a gallop. The ice groaned, cracking beneath the wheels, but they made it across in a spray of freezing water. One wheel slammed down hard on the far bank, jarring the wagon so violently the eldest girl cried out. Henry risked another glance back. Two of the riders had pulled up at the creek's edge, but the third pushed across, ice shattering under his horse's hooves. He's still coming. The boy yelled. Henry swerved onto a narrow ridge path. The drop to the left was sheer and steep, but it cut half a mile off the route to the settlement. The horse's hooves struck sparks against the frozen rock. The rider behind them fired a shot. The crack split the morning air, and a bullet sparked off the ridge wall just feet from Henry's head. The youngest child began to cry, muffled in her sister's arms. The injured woman stirred at the noise, weakly trying to sit up. Henry's mind worked furiously. If they reached the next valley, there was a chance, just a chance, they could lose him in the broken terrain. Beyond that lay the settlement. Another shot rang out, this one burying itself in the wagon's sideboard. Splinters flew. Henry swung the wagon down a rocky slope, the horse skidding dangerously but keeping its footing. The pursuing rider followed, but lost ground in the turn. By the time they reached the valley floor, Henry could no longer hear the other two riders. But the one behind them was still there. Relentless. Then dashed salvation. Through a gap in the trees, Henry saw the faint smoke of chimneys. The settlement was less than a mile away. He leaned forward, speaking low to the horse. Just a little more. Girl. The wagon surged forward, the noise of pursuit fading with each stride. But Henry knew this wasn't over. Men like McCrae didn't give up, they regrouped. And when they came again, they'd come harder. Still, for now, they had a chance. Almost there, Henry called back. And for the first time since finding them in his wagon, he saw a flicker of real hope in the children's eyes. The night fell heavy and silent over the clearing, but Henry's instincts told him silence in the wild often meant danger. The small campfire crackled softly, throwing orange light against the wagon side. The children slept in a huddled heap near their mother, who stirred fitfully in her bedroll. Henry sat a few feet away, sharpening his knife, his eyes fixed on the dark line of pines that circled them like watchful sentinels. He had moved the wagon into a small hollow earlier that day, hoping the terrain would hide them from prying eyes. But deep inside, he knew hiding wouldn't keep trouble away for long, not from men bold enough to slaughter a family. Around midnight, the wind shifted. Henry caught it, the faint, acrid scent of smoke. Not the sweet, lazy smell of a distant hearth, but something closer, fresher. His grip tightened on the knife. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. And the wrong kind of people meant death. Rose silently, boots barely crunching on the cold ground, and moved to the wagon. Peeling back the canvas, he whispered, "Stay quiet." Not a sound. The eldest boy, Samuel, blinked sleepily but nodded. Even at his young age, he understood. Henry grabbed his rifle and stepped into the tree line. The woods were black, the moon hiding behind a thick veil of clouds. Each step was measured, his breathing slow, ears straining for the smallest break in the night's rhythm. Then he heard low voices, rough and careless, drifting through the dark. They were close, maybe 100 yards away, their tone relaxed. In a way that told Henry they weren't worried about being overheard. "Reckon she took the brats into the woods," one voice said. "And I reckon we'll find 'em before morning," another replied with a laugh that made Henry's jaw tighten. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It was them, the men the children had described. They were here. Henry crouched low, edging toward the sound until he spotted a flicker of orange through the trees. A small campfire burned in a clearing, 3 men sitting around it, rifles resting lazily within arm's reach. Their faces were hard, weather-worn, and cruel. For a moment, Henry considered turning back, slipping away before they caught his scent. But as he pictured the children's terrified faces, and the woman pale, wounded, Fighting to live something shifted in him. He had seen death before, plenty of it, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he had a reason to stand between it and the innocent. He eased back through the trees, heart pounding. When he reached the wagon, Samuel was awake, sitting up with a small pocket knife clutched in his hand like he intended to fight grown men with it. Henry knelt beside him. "They're here," Henry murmured. "3 of them, armed, likely hunting you still." Samuel swallowed hard. "What are we gonna do?" Henry's voice was low and certain. "We don't wait for them to come to us." By the time the clouds parted to reveal a thin slice of moon, Henry had a plan. He doused the fire completely, plunging the camp into darkness. The children were moved to the wagon's far side, hidden beneath blankets and sacks. Henry's horse was tethered quietly, ready to move at a moment's notice. Then, with his rifle slung across his back and his knife in his hand, he melted back into the trees. This time, he wasn't scouting. He was hunting. Every step forward brought him closer to the glow of their campfire. The men were laughing again, one of them swigging from a bottle. They were relaxed, careless. That would be their mistake. Henry stepped into the edge of the firelight. "Evenin'," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. 3 heads snapped toward him, eyes narrowing in confusion before recognition set in. One man started to reach for his rifle. Henry moved faster. What happened next was quick, brutal, and silent except for the sharp crack of a branch underfoot and the muffled grunts of struggle. When it was over, the fire burned low, the clearing was still, and Henry stood alone, breathing hard, his knife slick in his hand. He didn't look back as he returned to the wagon. The children were still hidden, but Samuel was peeking out, eyes wide. Henry met his gaze and said quietly, "It's over. For now." But even as he said it, he knew the danger wasn't gone, not yet. Henry pulled the wagon into the shadow of the cottonwoods, the river murmuring softly behind them. The air was thick with tension, the sound of hoofbeats drawing nearer. He stepped down, rifle in hand, every muscle taut. Emily clutched her children close, whispering for them to stay quiet. The riders slowed as they approached, their horses snorting in the cool evening air. The man in front, a wiry figure with a scar slicing down his cheek, called out, "That's a fine wagon you've got there, friend. Mind if we take a look inside?" His tone carried the smug confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. Henry didn't answer right away. He studied them, noting the worn holsters, the glint of steel at their sides. "This is my wagon," he said evenly, "and there's nothing here for you." The scarred man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Funny thing is, we think you've got something that belongs to us, a woman, some kids." Henry's jaw tightened. "Not yours." "Never." "Were." That wiped the grin from the man's face. His eyes hardened. "Step aside, old man, or we'll step over you." Emily's hand found Henry's arm, her fingers trembling. He could feel the fear rolling off her, but beneath it was something else. Trust. Trust that he wouldn't hand them over. Henry took one step forward, placing himself squarely between the wagon and the riders. "You're not touching them." For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of the riders went for his revolver. Henry's rifle cracked in the still air, the shot splintering the dirt inches from the man's horse. The animal reared, throwing the rider off balance. "Next one won't miss," Henry warned, his voice like stone. The scarred man's smirk returned, but it was thinner now. "You think you can stand against all of us?" "I don't think," Henry said. "I know. But you ought to think about how far you're willing to push this. You follow me again, you'll regret it." The man's gaze flicked to the other 2 riders. For a heartbeat, Henry thought they might draw anyway, but then the scarred man spat into the dirt. "Ain't worth it, not today." He wheeled his horse around, and the others followed, their silhouettes fading into the dimming light. Henry didn't lower the rifle until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. Only then did he turn back to the wagon. Emily was staring at him, her eyes wide not just with relief, but with something like disbelief. You risked everything for us," she said softly. Henry shrugged, though his chest was still heaving from the adrenaline. "Couldn't let them take you." The children clambered down from the wagon, surrounding him in a small, silent huddle of gratitude. One of them, the boy who had whispered, "Don't kill us," that first night, looked up at him with wet eyes. "I knew you weren't like them," he said. Henry felt a lump in his throat. He reached out, resting a rough hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're safe now. I'll see to it." They spent the night camped by the river, a small fire casting flickering light on tired faces. Henry kept watch, his rifle across his knees, listening to the steady breathing of Emily and her children. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of purpose, not just to keep moving through the days, but to protect, to stand for something. By morning, the fear in their eyes had eased, replaced with cautious hope. Henry hitched the wagon again, and together they rolled into the settlement, the scarred men nowhere in sight. Folks came out to see them, and offers of food, shelter, and help poured in. Emily and her children were given a place to stay, but they clung to Henry's side as though afraid he might vanish. In time, the settlement became their home. Henry built a small cabin near the edge of town, close enough to hear the laughter of the children who now called him Uncle Henry. He never spoke much about the night by the cottonwoods, but Emily did, and the story of the quiet man who faced down 3 armed riders to save a family spread farther than Henry would have liked. Months later, as winter's first snow began to fall, Henry sat on his porch, watching the children chase each other through the drifts. Emily stepped out, a blanket around her shoulders. "You gave us back our lives," she said. Henry shook his head. "You just needed a place to rest. I gave you a wagon for the night. You made it a home." And for the first time in a long while, Henry Price smiled because it was true.